In this video, I'm going to show you how to get started with Vuex and how to move all of your app's data and methods into a Vuex store, into state, mutations, actions, and getters in around 30 minutes. If you're new here, my name's Danny. I'm an indie app developer and creator of Fudgit. If you want to learn about Vue JS, web development, app development, and all that good stuff, click subscribe and click the bell right now, mother flipper. And so what we're going to do here is create this simple counter app in the usual VueJS way by just adding data and methods to our Vue component. And then we're going to move all of our data and methods related to that data into a Vuex store, into state, mutations, actions, and getters. I'll also explain what Vuex is and why you would use it later on in the video. Let's get started by creating a new Vue 3 project using the Vue CLI. So I'm just going to Google Vue CLI, jump to the website and get started on installation. And if you don't already have the Vue CLI installed, you'll need to make sure you have Node installed first, which you can get to at nodejs.org. And you probably want to get the one on the left. And once that's installed, you can then install the Vue CLI with this command. And you should then be able to create a new Vue project. So I'm going to jump to creating a project. And we just need to run Vue create and then the name of our project. So I'm going to jump to my terminal, which is just running within VS Code, which is the editor I'm going to be using. And you want to make sure you're in the folder where you keep all your projects, and then just run Vue create, and let's call it learn-vuex. And you want to choose manually select features. And then using the spacebar, I'm going to enable the router, enable Vuex, and disable linter, just so we don't get loads of annoying messages. Then I'm just going to hit enter. And I'm going to choose Vue 3 for this, although everything I'm teaching you here should work in Vue 2 projects as well. I'm going to choose no to history mode. I'm going to choose in dedicated config files, and I'll choose no to saving this as a preset. Okay, it's finished creating our project, and we just need to cd into the folder and run npm run serve. So I'm just going to drag the project is created into VS Code, open up the terminal, and just run npm run serve. And that's now running, so I'm just going to command and click on this link to open it in the browser. And we now see a basic Vue.js app running in the browser. Let's get started by creating a basic counter app on this homepage. So I'm going to go to source and views and home.view. I'm going to get rid of this hello world component, which is adding all of this stuff. So I'll get rid of that. I'll get rid of this import. And I'll get rid of this components object as well. We can also just delete this hello world component in the components folder. So I'll delete that. Okay, so we now just have this Vue logo. So I'm going to stick a counter under that. So I'm going to create a div with a class of counter. I'll just stick 0 in there for now. And then underneath that, I'm going to add a div with a class of buttons. I'm going to stick one button, which just has a minus symbol inside it. And then one button, which has a plus symbol. So I'll save that. And I'll just add a bit of style to make these a bit bigger. So I'll add a style block. And we'll style each of these divs. Give them a bit of margin so we have a bit of space between everything. So I'll just target the div element. Just set margin bottom to 10 pixels. And I'll make our counter a little bit bigger. So we'll target this counter class. And just set the font size to, let's say, 80 pixels. And we'll style these buttons as well. So we'll target the button element within this buttons div. So dot buttons, button. And we'll set the font size to, let's say, 40 pixels. Save that. And I'm just going to make these buttons a bit wider. So I'll add a width property, set it to 100 pixels. And let's add a bit of margin as well. So I'll set the margin to 0 on the y-axis and 10 pixels on the x-axis. Save that. And this is looking pretty good now. So let's make this app actually work. So we're going to need a data property for this counter. So let's add a data method that returns an object. We'll add a property called counter, set that to 0. And we'll replace this 0 here with double curly braces and counter, so that it's using this property here. So I'll save that, and we still see 0. Okay, let's create a method for increasing this counter when we click this button. So I'll add a methods object, and we'll create a method called increase counter. And all we want to do here is increase this counter by 1. So we can just do this .counter plus plus. We want to trigger this method when we click this plus button. So I'll add a click handler to this plus button, which just fires that method. So increase counter, save that, and that's now working. And now let's do the same for decrease counter. So I'll just duplicate this increase counter method and rename it to decrease counter. And we just want to do this .counter minus minus. And we want to trigger it when this button is clicked, this minus button. So we'll add a click handler here and just trigger that method. Decrease counter, save that. And this is all working now. So what we want to do now is move our data and our methods, so this counter property and these methods, into a Vuex store. And we already have a Vuex store in our project. If we go to source, store, then index.js, we already have a Vuex store here, and it's already hooked up to our app, although there's nothing in it right now. Well, first of all, what is Vuex? Well, it's a state management pattern and library, which means it basically allows us to store all of our data and all of the methods related to getting that data and changing that data in one single centralized place in a Vuex store. And all of the components of our app have direct access to the data and the methods in this store. So why do we need all of our data and all of our methods in one centralized place? Well, in a simple app like this counter app, you might not need to. But in a more complicated app, you're going to want to break your app up into child components. This can get complicated if your data and methods are stored in one of your Vue components, because it means you need to do lots of passing props down from parent to child to get the data into your child components. And it also means you need to trigger lots of events from child to parent, etc. in order for your child components to trigger a method that's in one of your parent components. And this gets more and more complicated the more and more complicated your app gets. But with Vuex, we don't need to worry about all this, because all of the components in our app can grab data directly from the state in the store, and all of the components of our app can trigger the methods that are in our store as well. So Vuex makes it much easier for us to break our app up into manageable child components. And I will demonstrate breaking the app up into child components later on. But first, I'll just explain the different sections in our Vuex store. So the state is where we store the data of our app. So we're going to move our counter property into this state object. And all of the components of our app, no matter how deeply nested they are, have access to the data that's in the state. Mutations are methods which change the data that's in the state. And the only way we can actually change data that's in the state is by triggering or committing a mutation, as it's known. So once our counter is in the state here, we're going to add some mutations for increasing and decreasing the counter that's in the state. And we can commit these mutations from anywhere within our app. And one important thing to note about mutations is that we can't trigger asynchronous code inside a mutation. So if we need to reach out to an API and wait for some data, we can't do that inside a mutation. We can only trigger synchronous code, which will immediately change the data that's in the state. And when we talk about triggering mutations, we call it committing. So we commit mutations. Next we have actions. Actions are also methods, although they can't change data that's in the state. Although they can access data that's in the state. But if we want to change data from an action, then we need to commit a mutation from within that action first. However, we can have asynchronous code in our actions. So if we needed to reach out to an API and wait for a response before changing the data in our state, then we would make that API call from our action. And then once we've got the result, we would then commit a mutation, which would then alter the data that's in the state. And I'll demonstrate using APIs within actions later on. And when we talk about triggering actions, we call it dispatching. So we commit mutations and dispatch actions. And we don't see it here, but we also have a getters object where we can add some getters. And getters allow us to get data from our state. Now we can just directly access the state from any of our components in our app, so we don't always need a getter. However, with getters, we can change or filter the data in some way before it's made available to all of our components. So if we wanted to grab, say, the square of our counter and make that available everywhere in our app, then we could use a getter to do that. And we will add a getter later on. And finally, this modules object allows us to break up our store into multiple modules, with each separate module having its own state, mutations, actions, and getters. And I won't be covering this in this video, but let's say our app had a second page with some completely different functionality, let's say a shopping list. Then in that case, you might want to break up your Vuex store into one module for the counter and one module for the shopping list. Let's move our app's data and methods into this Vuex store. So we'll start by moving the counter into the store. So I'm going to jump back to home.vue, and then I'm going to copy our counter property here. And in fact, I'm just going to delete our data object now. Save that, jump back to index.js, and I'm just going to paste that inside this state object here. So I'll save that. And this counter property is now in our state. And we can't see our counter on our page because if we go to home.vue, it's looking for a local data property called counter. So we need to now instead grab the counter that's in the state in our store. So I'll get rid of counter here. And to access the store, we can just do $store. Then to access the state, we can just do $state. And then we could just access any property that's within the state. So we just want to access this counter property. So we just want to do store.state.counter. And I'll save that. And we can now see our counter again on the page. Except now this value is coming from this counter property in our state in our store. Okay, so let's move our methods, our decrease counter and increase counter methods into a couple of mutations in our store. So I'm just going to cut these methods and get rid of the methods object here. Save that. And I'm just going to paste them into this mutations object. However, we don't want to change this .counter. We want to change the counter that's in the state. So state.counter. And in order to access the state within a mutation, we need to pass the state into the method like this. And then we can just change this to state.counter. And here as well. I'll save that. And so these methods are now in our store, but we're not currently using them. So I'll jump back to home.vue and jump to these buttons. And our click handlers here are currently looking for some local methods which no longer exist. But we now want to commit these mutations here. So I'm just going to empty out these click handlers. And for the plus button, we want to commit the increase counter mutation. So again, to access the store, we can do $store. But this time we want to fire the commit method because we're going to commit a mutation. And then we just want to pass in the name of the mutation as a string. So the name is increase counter. So we just want to do store.commit increase counter. And I'll just copy this and paste it into the other button. And just change this mutation name to decrease counter. So I'll save that. And hopefully now everything should be working again. And it is. So we have some state, we have some mutations. Let's add some actions to our store. And remember, actions can have asynchronous code. So let's use some asynchronous code in our actions. So let's say when the user clicks this plus button, we want to grab a random number from a remote API and then increase this counter by that randomly generated number instead of just by 1. Now, of course, we could just easily generate a random number using JavaScript, but I'm just going to use this idea just to demonstrate how you can use APIs within actions. So I'll create an action with a corresponding name to this mutation in the actions object here. So I'll just call it the same name, increase counter. And for now, I'll just log out increase counter and then brackets action. And I'll save that. And now let's dispatch this action when this plus button is clicked instead of committing this mutation. So I'll jump back to home.vue and back to the plus button. And to dispatch a action, we just need to trigger the dispatch action instead of the commit action. So we can just change this to dispatch, and this will now dispatch our new action instead of committing this mutation. So we'll just open up the console to make sure that's working. Click on the plus button, and yeah, we can see our log there. So now let's use an API to grab a random number. And first of all, I'm just going to install Axios to make it a little bit easier for us to do this. So I'm just going to kill the dev process with Control-C, and then run npm install Axios. And that's now installed, so I'm just going to launch our dev server again with npm run serve. Okay, that's running again, so I'm just going to reload the page. And I'm just going to Google random number API. And I'm going to jump to this random.org. I'm going to scroll down to this link here, which gives us an example of using this API. I'll open that in another tab. And you can see here it's generated about 10 different random numbers. Just going to full screen this. And we're only going to need one number. So I'm going to change this num parameter from 10 to just 1. And now that's just generating one number. So I'm just going to copy this link from the browser, and then we'll use Axios to call this URL within our increase counter action. Well, first we need to import Axios. So I'm just going to add import Axios from Axios. And then in our increase counter action, I'm just going to do Axios and then pass in that URL that we copied. And I'll add a then block, which should give us a response. And I'll just log out the response. Let's just make sure that's working. I'll jump back to our app, click on the plus button, and we can see our response. And in this data property, we can see a random number. So if we click this again, we see a different random number this time. So what we want to do is send this random number as a payload from this action to this mutation. And this mutation will then add this random number to the current counter. So this number is going to be at response.data. So once we've got this response, we want to commit this mutation. And in order to commit a mutation from an action, we need to pass an object into this action with the commit method like this. And I'll just get rid of this console log. And now we can just do commit, and then the name of our mutation in a string, increase counter. And then we can pass along a payload as well. And we want to pass along this random number, which is at response.data. So I'll save that. And I'll jump to this mutation. And we need to receive this payload as well. So I'll add a second parameter here called random number. And I'll just get rid of this line for now and just log out that random number to make sure it's working. So I'll save that. Click on the plus button. And we can see the random number being logged out by our mutation. So now we just want to add this random number to our counter. So what we can do is state.counter plus equals random number. So I'll save that and let's see if it's working. Click on the plus button. And yeah, it's increased by 6. I'll click on it again. Now it's increased by 5. Okay, that's all working. So let's do the same for the decrease button as well. So I'm going to duplicate this increase counter action. I'll get rid of that console log actually on this one. We'll rename this action to decrease counter. And this time, after we've got the response, we want to commit the decrease counter mutation. So I'll change this to decrease counter. And we need to pass in this random number to this mutation as well. And now we just want to do state.counter minus equals random number. So I'll save that and we'll see if that's working. And that's not working, and that's because if we go to home.view, we're still committing our decrease counter mutation when we click on the decrease counter button instead of dispatching our new decrease counter action. So we just need to change this here to store.dispatch so that it dispatches the action instead, and we'll save that, reload. And that seems to be working now. It's decreasing it by a random number. If you found this video useful so far, make sure you smash the like button and leave a comment. Tell me what you want for Christmas. Let's add a getter to our store now. So let's say that we want to display the square of the current counter underneath the main counter. Well, we could use a getter to do that. So first, let's add some markup for displaying the square of this number. So I'm going to jump to home.view, and after our counter div, I'm going to add another div with a class of counter squared. And I'm just going to output our current counter first. So $store.state.counter. And then I'll add a space, a new line. I'll add a superscript tag with the number 2 inside it, which should look like a squared symbol. Then I'll add a space and equals, and then a space, and then a new line. For now, I'm just going to put XXX, but we will place our squared number here later. So I'll save that, and that's looking pretty decent. So now let's create a getter to get the square of the current counter. So I'll jump back to index.js in the store folder, and we'll add a getter. And we'll call this getter counter squared. We want to grab something from our state and modify it here. And in order to access the state, we need to pass it in as a parameter here. So I'll pass that in there, and getters need to return something. So we just want to return the square of the counter. So the counter multiplied by itself. So we can just return state.counter multiplied by state.counter. And I'll save that, and we should now have access to this getter. So I'm going to jump back to home.view, and we'll replace this XXX with the value from our getter. So we'll add double curly braces, and we just want to do $store. And then to access our getters, we do .getters, and then dot, and then the name of our getter. And our getter is called counter squared. So I'll put counter squared here. Save that, and I'll click on this button. And yeah, that seems to be working. 5 squared is 25, 10 squared is 100. Okay, so we've covered the basics of Vuex here: state, mutations, actions, and getters. However, Vuex gets a little bit more complicated when we start using text inputs with it and two-way binding. So I just also want to cover that as well. So let's add a text field to our app where we can enter a color name or a color code, which will give our counter a different color. So let's add the markup first. I'm going to jump to home.view, and then after our buttons div, I'll add another div, and I'll put a input in here, and we'll add a placeholder attribute and just put enter color code. I'm just going to split the attributes on this and save that. And we can see our input here. So let's add a state property to hold our color code. So I'm going to jump to index.js and add another state property here called color code. And let's just set it to blue initially. And I'll save that. And let's add a dynamic style attribute to this counter, which sets it to whatever color or color code is specified here. So I'm going to jump to home.view and to this div with our counter. I'm going to split the attributes here. By the way, I'm doing that with the split HTML attributes extension, which you can get from the VS Code extensions page. And we're going to bind to the style attribute here. And I'll add an object here. And we're going to set the color property. And we're going to set it to this state property here, color code. So we just want to set this to $store.state.colorcode. And I'll save that. And we can see our counter is now blue. And if we change this value to red, then it should be red. And now let's bind this color code property to this input so that the user can change the color. So I'll jump to home.view and to this input. And you might think that we could just add v-model and set that to $store.state.colorcode. And I'll save that. And I'll just reload the page. And if I change this to blue, it is working. It does change the color of the counter. However, we're not supposed to do it this way. We're not supposed to two-way bind with properties which are in our state. We're only supposed to change state properties using mutations. And I'm pretty sure in VueJS 2, we used to get an error if we tried to do that. But for some reason, we don't seem to be seeing the error in VueJS 3. But anyway, I'm going to jump back to home.view. Now we can still use vModel here, but what we need to do is set it to a computed property which contains a get method and a set method. A get method for grabbing the value from the state property and a set method for committing a mutation, which will then update the state property. So I'm going to remove the current value of this Vue model and we'll set it to a computed property called color code. We need to create this computed property. So I'll add a computed object and we'll add this color code computed property. And when we create a computed property which has a get method and a set method, we don't do it like this, like a method. We instead do it as an object with two methods inside it. So we need a get method and a set method. And in the get method, we just want to get the state property value color code from the state. So here we can just do return this $store.state.color code. And I'll save that and I'll just reload the page. And that seems to be working because this input is populated with the value of our color code state property. This set method will be triggered every time the value in this text input is changed. And just to demonstrate that, I'm just going to log out set, save that, and just type something in this field. And you can see it's logging out set every time we change it. What we want to do is get the current value of this input and commit a mutation in our state and send that new value as a payload. So we need to pass in a variable name here. You can use whatever you want. I'm just going to use new value. I'll just log out new value so you can see this working. Save that. And as I change the field, we can see the new value of the field being logged out every time. So now we just want to send this to a mutation. So let's commit a new mutation that we've not created yet. So we can do this $store.commit and we'll commit a mutation called, let's say, set color code. And we want to pass along this new value as a payload. So we'll pass that along, save that. And now we need to create this mutation. So I'm going to jump to index.js and create a new mutation here, set color code. And we need to pass in the state and we need to pass in the payload that we're sending. And again, I'll just call this new value. And all we want to do is set this color code state property to this new value. So we can just do state.colorcode equals new value. So I'll save that and I'll reload the page and hopefully this is working now. Type in blue and we see blue. Type in green and we see green. And since we have a bunch of mutations and actions with the same names, it's generally good practice to always have a matching set of mutations and actions. So let's just quickly create a set color code action, pass in the commit method. We'll just commit the set color code mutation. Oh, and we also want to pass the new value to this action. So after this object, we'll just pass along that payload. We want to commit the set color code mutation and pass along this new value. Save that. And then we want to change this computed property and the set method to dispatch the action instead of committing the mutation. So I'll just change this to dispatch and I'll save that. Make sure it's all still working. Yeah, that's working. Make sure our counter is still working. Yeah, seems to be. Now that all of our data and methods are in our Vuex store, it's going to be really easy for us to break our app up into child components without having to send data down to those child components and without having to trigger events from child to parent, which is one of the most beautiful things about using Vuex. So let's just quickly break this app up into child components. So this div with our counter here, I'm just going to cut that. And I'm going to create a new file in the components folder called counter.vue, scaffold a template, and paste in that div. And I'll save that, jump back to the home page, and we need to import this component. So I'll add a components object, and we'll use the HTML tag counter. And I'll just use the require method to import this component, but you can use the import method if you prefer. So @/component/counter.vue, and then we just want to place that component here. So counter, and I'll save that, reload, and everything's still working. So let's do the same for this counter squared div. I'll cut that, create a new component called counter squared.vue, paste in that div, save that, and we'll import that. So we'll call this element counter squared. And we want to change the path to counter squared. Save that. And we'll place that component here. Counter squared. Save that. And we can still see our counter squared. And let's do the same for these buttons. So we'll cut this buttons div. Create a new component for that. Buttons.view. And paste that in there. Save that. And import this component. And we'll call it buttons. Change the path to buttons.view. And we'll place that component here. Save that. And we still see our buttons. So let's finally just do the same thing for this div with the input. So I'll cut that, create a new component called colorcode.view, scaffold that, paste in the div, save that, and import it. We'll call this color-code, change the path to colorcode.view, and we'll stick that component here, colorcode. Let's see if that's still working. And that's not working anymore because we have this computed property, which is still on the home.view component. So I'm just going to cut this computed object and we'll add it to our color code instead. So I'll paste that there, save that, and let's see if that's working. Yeah, it's all working. So in just a couple of minutes, we've broken our app up into child components without too much messing about, all thanks to the power of Vuex. And I cover Vuex in more detail in some of my courses, which you can get to at dannys.link/courses, such as this Vuetify course, where we create a beautiful responsive app using Vuetify, VueJS, and Vuex. And this Quasar framework course, where we get to create cross-platform apps with VueJS and Vuex. And you can watch the start of these courses in these videos here. And please consider clicking the subscribe thing if you've not already. And thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.